I've titled my presentation, Dare to be Different. And when I reflect on stories of business or personal leadership that have inspired me throughout my life, they're typically stories of people that have had the courage and the vision to chart a new and untested, often risky, often unpopular path, and in the process redefined our view of what's possible. At the heart of my philosophy is a belief that business success is ultimately all about people. It's about their personality, their motivation, their commitment, their teamwork, their clarity of vision, the quality of communication, their integrity, their trust, and their relationships with each other. And throughout my career, I've been drawn to taking risks. I've sought out businesses that are distressed and in danger of failing. I've loved being an agent of change and charting a new path for those organisations. You know, at the same time, I'm acutely aware that anyone that tells you that they enjoy change is almost always someone that's inflicting it on others rather than someone that's on the receiving end. So successfully managing change therefore demands that you have the courage to empower people to feel some level of control over their own destiny, that you communicate honestly and openly, that you give people context and the opportunity to engage and contribute. And so I'm going to illustrate my approach to building brand identity and leading organisations through significant change by talking about my 8 years or so as CEO of Air New Zealand. And to give a little bit of history for Air New Zealand started out in the late 1930s as a state-owned organisation. And despite having been privatised in the 1980s and owned by private equity through most of the 1990s, there was still much that felt like a government department when I joined Air New Zealand in 2003. 18 months prior to my arrival, NZ Australia, which was wholly owned by Air New Zealand, had failed. And that happened on the same day as the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which caused a massive slowdown in global air travel. Air New Zealand almost went bankrupt, save for an injection of $800 million by the New Zealand government. So the then CEO of Air New Zealand, Sir Ralph Norris, gave me the challenge of developing the strategy and change program to get Air New Zealand back on track. At first glance, the strategic challenge for Air New Zealand was enormous. Our workforce was demoralised. The airline had suffered a decade of underinvestment. Aircraft and interiors were old and tired. The airline was struggling financially. Despite the government bailout, we lacked the scale and resources of our key competitors like Qantas. We had no obvious sources of competitive advantage. And many of our customers were openly critical of the airline, or even worse, they were ambivalent. My first step was to try and figure out whether we could uncover any viable sources of competitive advantage that our passengers would value. Because after all, most airlines are pretty much the same, right? We operate the same aircraft. You've got a choice of two, Boeing or Airbus. There are only two galley suppliers, a small number of seat manufacturers. We all use the same toilets. The only thing that we could identify that defined us as different from our competitors was that we knew New Zealand better than any other airline flying to and from our country. And the challenge we had is, how do you create value from that? So we began by looking at who our customers were, and I know it sounds so obvious, but it's absolutely essential that you know your customers better than your competitors do. We knew that almost 70% of the passengers on Air New Zealand international services were visitors coming to or returning from a trip to New Zealand, and the vast majority were travelling for leisure or tourist purposes. We didn't have very many business travellers. So we decided to interview a number of these visitors on arrival into New Zealand to try and figure out what attracted them to come to New Zealand. Predominantly, people described images of beaches or mountains, remote wilderness, rivers, lakes, bungee jumping. In essence, it was this kind of visual image of an unspoilt, uncrowded, remote natural wonderland. But the greater insight came when we interviewed those same visitors departing New Zealand and asked them what memories they were going to take back home with them. And rather than describing the scenery or the physical environment or attractions, the vast majority described the New Zealanders they'd met. There were some fabulous, authentic moments that were typically Kiwi. And I sat in on a number of those interviews. There were some great stories. You know, one of my favourites was this American chap, and he'd been travelling down the west coast of the South Island, and he'd gone into a local pub, and he'd ended up having a few beers with some of the locals, and they took him home that night, and he went out pig hunting in the bush the next day. It's starting to sound a bit like a scene from Deliverance, and this bloke was blown away. He said, you know, I'd only just met these people, and they welcomed him into their homes and lives like he'd known them all his life. So we collected hundreds of these similar stories and set about distilling these to identify the essence of what makes New Zealanders a little bit different, memorable, and a little bit special for visitors to our country. Our theory was that if we could infuse that personality into every aspect of the airline, we could make Air New Zealand and the people of Air New Zealand a memorable and inspiring part of the customer's adventure when they come to New Zealand. We aspired to become a company that embraced the Kiwi personality and played a leadership role on behalf of New Zealanders, projecting this personality onto the world stage. We envisioned a future where New Zealanders fell back in love with their national airline and were once again proud. It might not sound like a particularly radical or inspiring insight, but given the razor-thin profit margins in the airline industry, which typically operate around EBIT margins of around 2 or 3 or 4%, most airlines are just focused on the bottom line and the planes, which ones to fly, how to fit them out, how to charge fares, how to best maintain them, what to do with them when you have too many of them, and how to keep costs as low as possible. Yet in a service business, all the value is created by people interacting with people. Your decision on whether you fly on Qantas or Virgin or Air New Zealand next time is far more likely to be influenced by an interaction you had with one of the employees of that airline than the aircraft they're flying. If we were going to bring that Kiwi personality to life, we were therefore going to have to turn the airline model on its head and centre our business around the people rather than the planes. And when I say people, I mean all the people connected with our business, not just customers, but suppliers, shareholders, other key stakeholders, and most importantly, our employees. I believe your employees are the most important audience of all. If you don't have your employees on board, living and breathing, and consistently projecting your personality, your sense of collective identity every day, sharing your sense of purpose, you don't have a hope in hell of building a consistent brand personality and service experience for your customers. So I believe when you're creating transformational change, you don't actually put the customer in the center of your model, you put your employees in the center of the model. Your employees will create that experience for your customers.